The boarding area at Gate 22 buzzed with the usual mix of impatience and exhaustion that filled most late evening flights. Travelers shifted in their seats, checking watches, phones, and the large screen above the gate that still read boarding soon for Flight 782 to Seattle. Outside the tall glass windows, the airplane waited quietly beneath bright runway lights, its white body glowing against the dark sky. Inside, the aircraft preparations were already underway. Flight attendants moved through the aisle, checking overhead bins and verifying passenger lists, while the low hum of the plane's electrical systems filled the cabin. Near the jet bridge entrance, a man in dark jeans and a simple jacket walked calmly toward the aircraft door. He carried a small black flight bag in one hand and moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had walked this path many times before. His name was Marcus Carter. Most passengers waiting nearby barely noticed him, but a few heads turned when he stepped onto the jet bridge before general boarding had even begun. One woman frowned slightly. "Did they start boarding already?" Her husband shook his head while glancing at the gate screen. "No, it still says boarding soon." Marcus continued walking down the narrow jet bridge until he reached the aircraft entrance. One of the flight attendants standing by the door greeted him with a quick smile. "Evening, Marcus." "Evenings." He stepped into the cockpit area without hesitation. Back in the gate seating area, the woman who had noticed him leaned toward another passenger. "Did you see that man walk onto the plane?" The other passenger looked confused. "Yeah, why? He didn't look like crew." Another passenger joined the conversation. "I'm pretty sure pilots wear uniforms." Within minutes, whispers began forming small circles of speculation. "He just walks straight into the cockpit. Maybe he works maintenance. Then why does he have a pilot bag?" The woman eventually stood and walked to the counter. "Excuse me," she said to the gate agent. "A man just walked into the plane and into the cockpit. I'm not sure he should be there." The gate agent looked up from her screen. "Ma'am, crew members sometimes board early. He wasn't wearing a uniform." The gate agent hesitated slightly. "I'll take a quick look." A few minutes later, the aircraft door opened again, and a flight attendant stepped out onto the jet bridge. The gate agent leaned closer and spoke quietly. "There's a passenger saying someone entered the cockpit before boarding." The flight attendant frowned. "Who?" "A man in a jacket, carrying a flight bag." The attendant's expression shifted slightly. "Oh, that's..." But before she could finish the sentence, two airport security officers approached the gate. "We got a report about a possible unauthorized person entering the aircraft cockpit," one officer said. Passengers nearby turned immediately toward the conversation. The gate agent tried to clarify it might just be a misunderstanding, but someone said, "We'll check," the officer replied. Within seconds, the two officers began walking down the jet bridge. Inside the aircraft, Marcus sat in the right seat of the cockpit, reviewing a checklist displayed on a tablet. The control panels glowed softly around him. A knock sounded on the cockpit door. One of the flight attendants opened it. "Marcus, security is here." Marcus turned calmly. "Security." Before she could respond, the officer stepped into the cockpit doorway. "Sir, we need you to step out of the aircraft with us." Marcus looked up, surprised but calm. "Is there a problem?" "We received a report that you entered the cockpit without authorization." Marcus glanced at the flight attendant, who looked frustrated. "He's crew," she began. But the officer raised a hand slightly. "Sir, we just need you to come with us for a moment." Marcus slowly stood. "All right." The flight bag remained on the seat as he walked past them toward the jet bridge. Back in the boarding area, dozens of passengers immediately lifted their phones when they saw the officers escorting Marcus off the aircraft. The woman who had first reported him whispered to her husband, "That's him." One passenger began recording. The officer spoke calmly. "Sir, we just need to verify your credentials." Marcus nodded. "Of course." He reached into his pocket for his identification badge and handed it over. The officer studied it for a moment. "Marcus Carter, yes." The officer looked slightly confused. "It says pilot." Marcus simply nodded, but the officer glanced back toward the plane, uncertain. "We'll need to confirm this with the airline." Passengers watching nearby murmured quietly, "I told you something was strange." Another passenger whispered, "Maybe he found the badge." The filming phones continued capturing every second. Marcus stood quietly waiting. Inside the aircraft cockpit, another man suddenly appeared in the doorway. He wore a full airline captain uniform with 4 stripes across his sleeves. His name was Captain Daniel Reeves. He looked down the jet bridge toward the growing crowd and immediately noticed Marcus standing beside the security officers. Captain Reeves frowned and walked quickly toward them. "What's going on?" The officer turned. Sir, we're verifying authorization for this individual who entered the cockpit. Captain Reeves blinked once, then looked at Marcus. Why is Marcus standing out here? The officer responded cautiously. We received a report that he accessed the cockpit before boarding. Captain Reeves stared for a moment. Then he let out a quiet laugh. You're kidding, right? The passengers watching grew silent. The officer remained serious. Sir, we're just following procedure. Captain Reeves turned toward the crowd, slightly raising his voice. This man is Captain Marcus Carter. A ripple of confusion moved through the passengers. Captain Reeves continued. He is the senior training captain for this airline and the instructor responsible for evaluating pilots on this route. Several phones lowered slowly. The officer blinked. I'm sorry, he's the training captain. Captain Reeves nodded. Yes, tonight he's conducting a routine cockpit evaluation before takeoff. Marcus remained calm beside them. The officer quickly handed his badge back. Our apologies, Captain. Marcus gave a small nod. It's all right. But Captain Reeves looked toward the passengers who had been recording the scene. For the record, he said calmly, the person you just saw escorted off the plane is one of the most experienced pilots in this airline. The quiet crowd shifted uncomfortably. The woman who had reported Marcus lowered her phone. Captain Reeves continued. He has logged over 15,000 flight hours and trained hundreds of pilots. Marcus finally spoke softly. Daniel, it's fine. The officer stepped aside. You're free to return to the aircraft, Captain. Marcus picked up his flight bag and began walking back toward the plane. As he passed the passengers, many avoided eye contact. A few whispered apologies. One man spoke quietly. Sorry about that, sir. Marcus nodded politely. Inside the aircraft cockpit, Marcus returned to his seat while Captain Reeves closed the door behind them. Well, Reeves said, shaking his head. That was a new one. Marcus smiled slightly. Not really. Reeves looked at him. You've had that happen before? Marcus adjusted the tablet on the console. A few times. Reeves sighed. Still ridiculous. Marcus simply continued the checklist. Outside in the boarding area, the atmosphere had shifted completely. Passengers who had recorded the moment now watched quietly as the crew prepared for boarding again. The woman who had first raised the concern sat down slowly. I thought I was helping, she whispered. Her husband nodded. I know. Moments later, the gate agent returned to the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin boarding flight 7082 shortly. Passengers slowly lined up. When boarding finally began, many stepped onto the aircraft thinking about the moment they had just witnessed. Inside the cockpit, Marcus completed the final systems check. Reeves glanced at him. You ready to evaluate my flying tonight? Marcus smiled. Always. The aircraft door closed a few minutes later. Passengers buckled their seatbelts as the plane pushed back from the gate. From the cockpit windows, the glowing runway stretched into the distance. Marcus looked out at the lights before turning back to the instruments. All right, Captain Reeves, he said calmly. Let's see how you handle Seattle tonight. The engines roared to life as the aircraft rolled toward the runway. And somewhere behind the cockpit door, dozens of passengers sat quietly, realizing they had almost judged the very man responsible for keeping their flight safe in the air. Marcus adjusted the headset over his ears as the aircraft slowly rolled away from the gate. The tug vehicle guiding the plane stopped and disconnected while the engines continued humming with a low, steady vibration that filled the cockpit. Captain Reeves glanced over at Marcus with a small grin. Well, that was an interesting start to the flight. Marcus looked down at the instrument panel while flipping through the final checklist on the tablet. Airplanes have taken off under stranger circumstances. Reeves chuckled. I guess that is true. Outside the cockpit, passengers were still settling into their seats. Overhead bins slammed shut and flight attendants moved down the aisle, double-checking seatbelts and luggage. But the earlier incident had not completely disappeared from people's minds. In seat 14A, the woman who had first spoken to the gate agent sat staring quietly at the back of the seat in front of her. The glow from her phone screen lit her face as she scrolled through social media. Someone had already uploaded the video. The clip showed Marcus standing beside the security officers while passengers whispered and recorded him. The second half showed Captain Reeves walking onto the jet bridge and explaining who Marcus really was. Thousands of views had already appeared in less than 20 minutes. Comments continued pouring in. People criticizing the passengers, people defending them, people discussing how quickly assumptions could spread in crowded places like airports. The woman swallowed slowly and turned the phone face down on the tray table. She suddenly felt embarrassed thinking about how confidently she had reported Marcus to the gate agent. Across the aisle, a young man leaned toward his friend. "Dude, that pilot evaluation thing is crazy." "What do you mean?" "The guy they stopped is basically the instructor for the captain flying this plane." The friend shook his head, and people thought he was sneaking into the cockpit. They both looked toward the front of the aircraft, where the cockpit door remained closed. Inside the cockpit, Marcus and Captain Reeves continued running through pre-takeoff procedures. Reeves adjusted a few switches and checked the throttle controls. "You know," Reeves said after a moment, "some of the passengers probably still don't believe it." Marcus looked over briefly. "Believe what? That you're the training captain?" Marcus shrugged slightly. "It doesn't really matter." Reeves shook his head. "Should matter." Marcus paused before responding. "When I first started flying 20 years ago, things were a lot worse." Reeves listened quietly. "I used to walk into airports where people assumed I was part of the cleaning crew." Marcus continued calmly. "Even when I was wearing the full pilot uniform." Reeves frowned. "That's unbelievable." Marcus gave a small smile. "Not really. People see what they expect to see." Reeves leaned back slightly in his seat, thinking about the moment on the jet bridge. "Well, tonight, they definitely learned something." Marcus nodded once. The aircraft reached the edge of the runway and paused while the control tower cleared them for departure. Outside the windows, runway lights stretched endlessly into the distance like glowing lines across the dark pavement. A calm voice crackled through the radio headset. "Flight 782, you are cleared for takeoff." Reeves pushed the throttle forward and the engines roared louder. The aircraft surged down the runway, gathering speed as the city lights beyond the airport blurred into streaks of color. Passengers pressed gently into their seats while the plane lifted smoothly into the night sky. High above the runway, the aircraft leveled slightly as it began climbing toward cruising altitude. Inside the cabin, the seatbelt signs remained lit while the engines settled into a steady rhythm. The woman in seat 14A looked out the window at the dark clouds passing by. She thought again about the moment on the jet bridge. How quickly everyone had believed something was wrong. How quickly the situation had turned into a crowd recording a man who had done nothing except walk to his job. She opened her phone again and watched the video one more time. This time she focused on Marcus himself. His calm expression. The way he had not raised his voice or shown anger even while standing in front of dozens of suspicious strangers. She quietly typed a comment under the video. "Sometimes the person we doubt the fastest is the one with the most responsibility." Then she set the phone down again. Up in the cockpit, Marcus looked out across the horizon where the first faint glow of distant city lights reflected against the clouds. Reeves checked the navigation system and smiled. "Everything looks perfect." Marcus nodded. "Good." Reeves glanced at him. "You know something." "What?" "When we land in Seattle tonight, none of those passengers will ever forget who was sitting in this cockpit." Marcus smiled slightly but kept his eyes on the instruments. "That's not important." Reeves raised an eyebrow. "Then what is?" Marcus looked forward calmly as the aircraft continued gliding smoothly through the dark sky, getting them there safely. The plane continued its steady climb through the night, carrying dozens of passengers across the country. Behind the cockpit door, most of them had finally relaxed, settling into quiet conversations or closing their eyes to sleep. But many of them were thinking about the moment they had witnessed at the gate. A moment when assumptions had almost overshadowed reality. And far above the clouds, the same man they had doubted earlier sat calmly guiding the aircraft forward, quietly doing the job he had spent decades mastering. The job that required skill, focus, and thousands of hours of experience. A job that none of the passengers would ever see directly. Because sometimes the people responsible for the greatest safety in the room are the ones others question first, simply because they do not match the picture someone expected to see.